We should be going live right about now. And we are live.
Wish I had some headphones. I'd feel really official.
It will get distracting otherwise if you did have headphones, I think. I haven't tried that yet, but we'll see. So hi, welcome to Seattle.
Thank you. I've been here a whole 30 minutes.
And I am the one who gets access to you completely for the first couple of hours. This is going to be fun. This is our first time meeting in person. So fun times ahead.
We've texted and emailed.
And we chatted.
And we did, briefly, but this is the first time meeting.
Is this your first time at Expo?
No, this is my third year coming here. And all of the years have been very different. So my first year was in Atlanta in 2016. And then last year I was here and now back here. I'm
sorry, I seem really distracted. It's just that it looks very bright in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to make it less bright. So that will be much better. There we go. Done. Okay, back to you. Sorry.
No
I tell everyone you're the coffee fermentation queen.
Yes. I prefer the term goddess.
Oh, I like that.
Yes.
I have a tattoo for anyone.
I didn't give myself that name. I sound a little ridiculous, but it was when I started. My boss at Scott Laboratories, just as a joke, was saying, be the coffee goddess. And I really liked it. I liked the...
Oh, it's wonderful.
It was a really good, mentality to go forward, so.
How did you... why coffee? Well, let's start before that. Because you're a microbiologist.
Mm-hmm.
A woman after my own heart. Us little scientists. But at what point did you decide, I want to go and explore the world of coffee?
So I didn't. And I really didn't even drink coffee. And it took me a long time to even begin to drink coffee after I started working in the coffee industry. I had this alarm, and people who know me will know this is true. I had this alarm on my phone that would go off by 9 to on my iPhone to remind myself to drink coffee. Drink coffee today. And I'd be like, oh yes, I have to drink coffee today. Yes.
Girl, we've got some way to teach you, don't we?
And when I first left college, it was 2007. I was working in San Francisco. And I just needed a job, and so I was working as a barista, and I opened the cafe. So I had to be there at 5 a.m. to open.
Yep.
And I never drank the coffee. I'm just a naturally early morning person. Mm-hmm. So here I was having to be at work at 5, making coffee for other people, and it never occurred to me to
taste
drink it.
it.
Yeah.
For real.
I was a horrible barista.
No, well, I don't know. There are some baristas out there that think it's not an important part of the job.
Tasting the product, not a big deal. So I didn't taste it, and I didn't drink it. But I think most people that were coming at 6 a.m. were not that picky about their coffee, and so.
How long ago was this?
So this was it was the end of 2007, beginning of 2008.
Yeah.
So that was the first time that I was in the world, but not even really part of coffee. And then what happened? How did I get into coffee? So I studied microbiology at UC Davis and went into, I loved chemistry. I actually loved chemistry more than biology, and was studying to be a chemist. And I worked in a lab at UC Davis. And after 3 years of working in a lab, it was such an isolating experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel that's why you don't see as many women in science, is because the structure of the work is I was alone in a lab for hours and hours, and I was 3 years into my degree and I already hated it. I was I can't see myself doing this, but I love chemistry. I don't know what to do with this. So on accident, I was on starting my last quarter in college and was desperate for units. Because of my chemistry labs, I had a very schizophrenic schedule of what was available, and I was under the requirement for units. So I was going through the course catalog from A to Z. I just need anything that's 2 units so that I can still maintain full status as a student. and I was in Intro to Viticulture. I was down in the V's. I had gone from A to V and would just like take anything.
What is Intro?
Intro to Viticulture. So UC Davis is an agricultural school, and so viticulture is a science of grape growing.
Oh,
so
wow.
it's specifically grape growing, plant biology focusing on the vine. And I just took it and I was like, that's fine. I don't care what it is. I just need a class. And I showed up the first day of that class, and learned about winemaking and learned how I could use my chemistry and move more towards biochemistry and microbiology to this applied field. And I just was so... it really was like this light bulb moment of like, this is what I'm going to do with my life. Because I was so lost at that point. I was like, I've spent 3 years heading in this direction and I'm miserable.
And I don't want to be in a lab.
I don't want to be in a lab by myself. And I just happened to like be at UC Davis, a school known for winemaking that's an hour away from Napa Valley. And so most people go into winemaking as a second career. So most of the other, that day I went to the office and I said, I'm changing my major, I'm going to do viticulture. And I didn't even drink wine. All my friends were like, you don't even like wine. I'm like, not important.
It's fine. I have the same relationship with coffee.
Yeah. That's not why is that a requirement?
Really not a requirement. Not in Lucia's world.
Yeah, I just loved the science. And so I switched my major. And once I was in that major, I realized that most people were PhDs, were master students or second backs, so people that had other careers. So
okay, that's what a second back is?
A second bachelor.
Okay.
So they had gone off, and a lot of them were, doctors or lawyers, and had kind of burnt out in their careers, and then went back to school, and they're like, I'm going to do my passion, and I'm going to...
Again, another correlation with coffee.
Yeah, I'm going to do my, the thing that I really want to do, which is wine. And for me, I was just like, this is it's almost like going to be an accountant. It was the most logical progression of it was not a passion. It was just like, this is something I can do as an applied of my degree. It's because I knew a lot of people once they graduated who had degrees in all kinds of things that were not doing anything related.
Yeah.
Doing anything
dude, same thing. I have a genetics degree.
Yeah.
And then went and worked in asset management for IBM. Hello.
Yeah, so it was almost like a trade school. It's like I went and I studied how to make wine, and then I went to make wine. It was just...
That's great.
Really, really... But I think that also comes from being an immigrant. Like, I wasn't born in this country. Like, I just had... Like, there was something about me who would have loved to study French poetry or, Italian film. But it's like, that's not...
It's not functional. It's not a grown-up thing to do. It's fantastic to do that at 60 or 70. Like, I have these dreams that I'm going to go back to school at 85 and study philosophy because I'm deeply passionate about it, or quantum physics or something like that really explores consciousness. But I can't fucking do that now. I'm not going to get a career in that, but I want to do it when I'm ready to learn.
Yeah.
For no reason. No, for no reason. Go on.
Well, yours is philosophy and physics. Mine was like French poetry.
I kind of see those as the same thing. To certain people, they're the same kind of romanticism as those things.
Well, so then I went into winemaking again because it was the most unromantic, most logical, direct path. And I really enjoyed it.
Although winemaking does have a romance about it.
It does. It absolutely does.
It's as close to winemaking, French poetry, as a functional job can have.
It has really served me. So I took French, and that really helped, I think, move my career forward in the wine industry, just because I could talk to a little more people and have more of a connection to the culture. So that was great. But it is a really romantic career, but that's not why I got into it, and that's not what I like. Eventually I fell in love with it, but that's not why I did it. It was almost like an arranged marriage, and then I learned to love my partner.
Oh yes, they were right. They got it right. They could see what I couldn't see.
Yeah. So I worked in Napa so I started, my first internship was 2006, and then I started working at Domaine Chandon in 2007 as an intern.
Wow.
Making sparkling wine, which was great, and then just kind of bounced around a little bit.
Did you drink?
I wasn't 21 yet when I switched my majors, and so I waited. It wasn't part of my culture growing up. My parents didn't really drink that much wine. It wasn't really around. So I had to do that. I had to be okay, let's go to the store and buy some wine and learn to drink. And one of the courses at UC Davis is a tasting sensory class. So you do have to wait to be 21, and then you can do that process. But again, it wasn't I really fell in love with the fermentation and the microbiology of winemaking, and the tasting and the romantic part kind of came later. And those definitely did come, and I do love wine so much.
Well, it sounds like you find a romance in bugs.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm right there with you.
I love bugs.
Yeah, there's something quite fascinating about the microcosm of the world that they live in versus even our world is a microcosm compared to the greater expansive universe and whatnot. But then there's such a romance in the idea of there's these creatures and they live in communities and they have their own ecosystems, and you can manipulate those ecosystems, and what happens if I give them this kind of sugar as opposed to that kind of sugar. And I think it's super romantic. So clearly you and I are weird.
I didn't think it was that weird.
Weird? Well, because when I say weird, people think I'm talking about weed.
Oh, gotcha.
So
you say weird.
I do. Go ahead. Enough about me.
So I was working in wine, had a really nice job working at this winery called Opus One, who makes fantastic wine in Napa Valley. And I was really happy there, but I got this opportunity from Scott Laboratories, who was a yeast supplier. So I had a relationship with Scott Labs for six or 7 years as a customer of theirs. I bought their yeast, I bought their nutrients, I bought their corks. They supply many things for the wine industry. And again, my friend Alex Scott came to me and he said he was taking care of the market in Mexico, and it was like a personal project of his, but he was having a family and he was just traveling and being gone all the time, and so he wanted somebody who spoke Spanish, who he had a relationship with, who knew wine and could be a representative for them in that market. So it would be changing from production to sales, but there was such a lack of knowledge there that I felt like I could be really useful as someone who had technical winemaking skills in working with winemakers in Mexico. And he's like, and we're like getting into coffee too, with yeast and experimenting in that area. So it's kind of proposed as both, do wine and do some coffee. And for me, it was an opportunity to just make my world a little bit bigger. Like in Napa, my world was really tiny. It was just Napa.
Everyone knows everyone.
Everyone knows everyone. And also I was helping to make very expensive wine, and it just wasn't very accessible. Like it's $300 a bottle. Not a lot of people can drink that. And I felt just kind of isolated in that world. And so the idea of doing something, not only was I expanding to a different country, but a different area, it seemed like, okay, that's again kind of a logical thing. I'll do that. And so I started working for Scott Laboratories in 2014 and doing both, working with I moved to Mexico, working with winemakers there with fermentation and some of the products that Scott Lab sells, and then at the same time started going to Origin and taking these different yeast strains and seeing how we can get different flavors from the fermentation.
And when you say you're going to Origin, was this for wine or was this for coffee?
For coffee.
So
I started going to Panama, Costa Rica. Mexico actually, even though I was living in Mexico took a while to get. We were mostly going to Guatemala, El Salvador, going to lots of different places. And then for about a year and a half, I was doing both, and I was stretched so thin and so stressed out because the wine harvest and the coffee harvest are kind of opposites. And with the wine harvest, it's like, yeah, you work really hard, but then you have the downtime. And I was just going from harvest to harvest to harvest to harvest.
Yeah, wow.
And so it just felt unmanageable. So at that point, I went back and I talked to my bosses, and I had like a little breakdown, and I was like, I can't do both. And they're like, that's fine. Which one would you prefer? Do you want to stay in wine, or do you want to take care of coffee? Because we can hire someone to keep doing Mexico, or we can hire somebody else to do coffee if you want to stay in wine. And so I had this moment where I had to choose, do I want to leave behind, the last 9 years of my career?
Wow. And
do something totally different that, again, I didn't even drink coffee. This was not my thing.
But you've been there, done that. You can figure this shit out again.
And again, it was, so the theme was like the bigger life. Because before, again, I was making wine in Napa, and that was really small. So then I was like, well, if I'm working in Mexico and working at a different price point, that's more accessible, and I can share more. But with coffee, a lot more of the world drinks coffee than they do wine.
It's the second most traded commodity in the world.
So I was like, this is the bigger life. So I decided to go in that direction, and haven't looked back since. But again, it wasn't because I had a passion for coffee. It wasn't because I even drank coffee. It was more kind of being...
It was a career choice.
Guided in that direction, saying like, how can I have a bigger impact and have a bigger life?
Because it's not necessarily about the coffee or the wine, it's about the bugs.
It's about the bugs, but it's also about, for me, it's about the people in terms of, like I said, more people drink coffee. I can talk to more people. It's more a part of people's daily life, and it's something that I can contribute to.
I talk a lot about life currencies in Map It Forward in my when we talk to people about how they map a career, and we talk about identifying what your life currencies are. And your life currencies are things that make you feel wealthy. So money can't make you feel wealthy. Money can only meet your basic needs. And then even though you've got a lot of it, it doesn't make you life rich. Right? And so I spend a lot of time defining for my businesses as well as for myself what my life currencies are. It took me a little while to figure them out, and now I'm staunch on them. What would you say, because it sounds like that was a part of what was leading into your approach to coffee or wine, or like what kind of a life do I want to have, and how wealthy? What would you say your life currencies are, do you think?
I think, like, I haven't thought about it in that context, but hearing what you have to say, I would say my currency would be having an impact and having a louder voice, and trying to put myself in situations where I can make that happen.
Yeah, wow, that's great.
And I think about also to honor my parents' sacrifice from leaving Guatemala and coming to the United States, and that was a huge effort and a huge change, and I want to honor that from having, like, if I had stayed in Guatemala, I'd have a very different life.
Oh yeah.
And I think a much smaller life than growing up in California, growing up in the United States. And I don't think coffee is the end of the line. I think it's the next thing in this path that in some ways I feel like has happened to me, but in other ways it's been a very deliberate path. So like I said, I didn't grow up thinking I wanted to make wine or be in any of these positions, but I wouldn't say it's by accident that I
don't believe in accidents at all. And it sounds like what's happened has happened for you, and the happy accidents that are not really accidents have kind of guided you there. When you talk about impact, what kind of an impact do you want to have?
I'm very passionate about education and access. So I think I was really lucky to have grown up in California and just, like I said, been so close to UC Davis, been really close to Napa, and I saw how much Napa is a world leader in quality in wine, and that's a large part due to how close they are to a university, to a world-class university like UC Davis, where there is a lot of research, there's a lot of sharing, there's a lot of information that gets spread around, that get lots of questions asked. And then when I went down to Mexico, I realized the quality was lagging because they don't have those resources.
Yeah, wow.
And you could see the disparity very, very clearly. And so I wanted to contribute what I had learned and what I could illuminate in some ways. And most of it is, I don't think there's a right way to make wine or a right way to make coffee, but we do know what doesn't work. So if we can just stop doing the stuff that we know we've all tried.
Please keep creating that impact. Please keep creating that impact.
It's like, we know there are things that don't work, so let's stop doing that and then, kind of move forward. And so with coffee, I feel like it's an extension of what I saw in Mexico, where there's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of passion, but the education or the structure isn't in place yet. It's a newer industry in that sense. Like
the Mexicans are very excited about what could come. I have some have you heard of Des Cortez? Down in TJ? They're a really interesting story. They started as an architectural firm, and all of the owners are passionate coffee lovers, and they wanted to build cafes, and so they started building these cafes, and this was a way for them to explore their passion for coffee. And so what you've got is a big, in TJ, in Tijuana, a culture that's starting to really bubble, that is not only passionate about coffee, but open-minded around, hey, we don't know everything, how are we going to learn it?
Yeah.
And there are some people down there that are super trapped, in the sense that they're well ahead of what they have been exposed to. And they're the kind of people who would just say, like, find a way to get out and go, you know, they've worked in other places before, ended up back in TJ, and, you know, they're the caged people who need to go and start experimenting in other regions of the world with regards to coffee. But they're very proud, the Mexicans, of their coffee.
I was going to say that that's something I've noticed that's a little bit of a conflict point with Latin culture, is the pride and that ego. And it's hard to learn when you're not open and you have so much pride in your tradition. But the market's changing, and so there's this, like, you see people, because I think that they think that there's a trade-off. You have to reject your past, or you have to say, well, if we want to do it differently, then that means we've been doing it incorrectly, and they don't want to say that, and so there's that limitation. I think that's tricky.
There needs to be some sort of a compromise between this idea of being proud of your culture and where you've come from, and stepping into the idea of evolution, and that evolution is built off of the pride that you have from your culture, right? And it's a great thing. And that if you keep pushing your boundaries and opening your mind and welcoming other people into that experience, all you get is better of the same rather than more of the same. And it's something that I hope a lot of cultures start embracing around, like, all over the world. In every culture that I've been in, I think that the one thing that the coffee industry, I hope, is fashioning itself towards, at least what I'm observing, is more people are starting to step into, well, we're not doing it the best that we can. And there are a few, I was talking with Matt Pergo last night here on the podcast. We talk about the idea of automation. And there are progresses that are happening that are going to be so far beyond people's scopes that whether they want to keep up with it or not, it's see ya, like, this is happening. And if you don't get on board, you're going to be left behind. And I feel like the same thing's going to happen with coffee farming. The same thing's going to happen all over the shop. And as a global community, we need to start just getting on board with it and figuring out what role we all have to play in that. Otherwise, you can sit there and bitch and moan about, you know, I don't want this to happen, I want it all to stay the same. In the meantime, the train's leaving the station saying, fuck you very much, we're going. Right.
That I really like, I use the exact same language when I talk about the work that I do with fermentation, in saying that a lot of people are approaching it as this, like, new innovation and trying out yeast strains and trying out, you know, these methods. But for me, it's like, this isn't trendy and this isn't new. Like, this is happening, and this is happening without you. And what I'm saying is, like, wake up. It's like, take the blindfold off and, like, look where we're going, because the way that it's been happening, it's been blind. And so this isn't new, it's just paying attention to what's already been happening.
We had a conversation, you and I, it would be like a month ago now. And we were talking about how people don't necessarily get on board with, and you were quite surprised with how not analytical the coffee industry is. And we were talking about it last night as well today, Jared and I. And you're right, there's this seemingly, like, it's a no-brainer, we should be an analytical industry. People should be stepping into their careers and saying, okay, I want to measure stuff, I want to understand it, I want to know the science behind it. And one would assume the people are across that. When I was coming up so I've been doing this for 15 plus years. And I was thinking the other day how dumb we were, because we used to call ourselves like intuitive baristas. We didn't weigh shots. We didn't time anything.
Yeah.
Even
just
though
felt the energy.
Right. The coffee was speaking to me. My espresso, I could hear it and smell it and see it, and therefore I knew it was amazing. God, we had our heads up our asses. But when you look back at it, well, 15 years ago, they had scales and they had timers. Like, it's not ancient. They had all these things, and yet we didn't approach it. Like, how did we not think to weigh things and to measure volumetrics and to time things and to do all that kind of stuff? And yet now we see it as so progressive. It's really fucking not. It's really not. And so I think if you're not a barista that's getting on board, if you're not a roaster that's getting on board with like all the stuff that Scott's talking about with regards to, I think it's really fun that the three of us are doing these workshops in the same place, because we've all kind of got the same mindset about all of it. But, we were talking in the workshop that we did a little while ago, the very first Mapping a Career as a Coffee Roaster. There was a conversation being had that you don't really need software to roast coffee. And so I said to the person, well, why do you think you don't need software to do it? And he's like, because I can just tell what the coffee is doing. And look, I'm not saying that you're going to have shit coffee. I'm saying that you won't know with any level of consistency or comfort what's going on with your equipment or with your coffee. And I guess the same thing is with what you're talking about, in the sense that you've got to start doing these things.
And just paying attention to things that are already happening. And something that you said, so I think that type of intuitive approach it's not wrong, but it's kind of a luxury that you earn after a while. So I think some people who like see me work or who may know me, like I work that way. Like, I think of myself as intuitive. Like, I just kind of show up and I'm like, I think we should do this strain, or like, it's all of these things that I think are intuitive, but it's because for the last 10 years my software has been like running in the background collecting data, and it's actually an intuition based on 10 years of experience. And so it's coming from someplace. It has that baseline.
It's
so on the outside it seems like I'm just kind of showing up and sprinkling, magic dust or whatever, but because I had that training. So I think that it's not being there that's the problem. It's kind of how you get there. So if you just sort of show up and say like, yes, I'm an intuitive barista, or I'm an intuitive microbiologist.
Oh, that's a great
first year. Then I don't really trust that. But
I wonder why. Well, these people who've been roasting for 6 months and call themselves master roasters have never used software.
I think there are some gifted people. I've met some people that have very interesting skill sets, but it's rare. And I think, but the broader point to what you said, and what I really fight for, is quality. To me, has to have a component of consistency. If that's not there, I don't think you can call something high quality. And how are you going to know your consistency if you're not measuring any of these metrics?
Right.
And I think what you were saying earlier about kind of the approach in the coffee industry, I think it's most of the people that I see are very curious, and they do want to have a scientific approach. And I think a lot of people try, but if you don't have that training, it's really difficult to stumble upon a proper scientific method. I think we, can read, okay, we're supposed to do one variable at a time, and we have these things that we've heard of what proper scientific method is, but it's so rare that people know what that is. And I think about it like managing people. It's a skill that I think is definitely a skill. Like, not everyone's born a great manager, and some people have maybe better personalities. It makes it a little bit easier for them to manage large teams. But for the most part, like, if you're not taught how to be a manager, or how to talk to people, or how to, address conflict, it's really hard to be an awesome manager, like right out the gate.
Yeah.
So again, it's a skill that seems pretty simple, but it's not intuitive. You're not born a fantastic leader. You're not born a scientist. You really have to have that training. And most people don't have that training. And when you don't have that training, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you're missing. And what I see is people setting up experiments and asking the wrong questions. It's like most of the time I see that, like, we did this and we proved this and we have this. I'm like, but the question was wrong. Like, the whole setup was, you're not asking interesting questions.
Yes.
So, that's sort of my beef with the approach so far. And it's hard because you don't want to discourage people, because I'm like, this is great. Like,
at least they're open to it.
Right. Let's be more engaged. Let's do this more. But let's do it better.
What's an example of the wrong kinds of questions?
Oh my gosh.
You don't have to use the like, what are people doing out there that could be done better with regards to fermentation?
Well, I think we're looking at it in a very binary way for the most part right now. Like I said, most people are talking about the one that's inoculated and the one that's not, or the one with yeast and the one without yeast, and not understanding that these microbes are everywhere. They're coming in on the skin of the cherry, they're on our skin, they're
in the water,
in the equipment, they're everywhere. So it's not that one has it and the other one doesn't, it's one's known and one's uncontrolled.
Is it difficult for people to get that? Because, I mean, we know it because we've studied it, but
yes.
Do other people just think water doesn't have bugs in it?
I think so.
Oh, wow.
I think so.
Air doesn't have... Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
Because it's something that you can't see.
So people just assume that it's not there, that it's clean?
I think so. Or the only way that they think that it has an impact if it's dirty. So if you see dirty water,
they can see the dirty water,
right?
So like they wouldn't,
right?
Even though that bottle's been sterilized, there's still bugs in it. But they're just assuming?
I think so. I think
wow, because it's clear.
I think they're assuming dirt because bacteria was the word for dirt. It was the word for spoilage and bad. So bacteria doesn't really have a positive definition outside of bacteria is a thing that makes you sick. Mm-hmm. Bacteria is spoilage.
And so because you're not sick, therefore there's no bacteria in what you're drinking and touching and smelling and breathing.
I think that's part of it. I mean, the education levels are a huge range. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times the language hasn't really caught up. One of my favorite parts of working in Spanish countries is the cherry has 6 botanical parts. Like we talk about the exocarp, the mesocarp, and the pericarp. We're talking about parenchyma cells. We're talking about the germ. But all of those parts contribute to the flavor development and are part of processing, removing the pulp, removing the mucilage, drying the seed. But in Spanish, 3 of those things have the same word. So you take the skin off and it's pulpa. And then you have the mucilage, and that's pulpa too. And then when you have the pulped coffee, they call that pulpa too. And so you have one word that's describing 3 very different botanical stages that all have different microbial action. And so it's very limiting when you don't have the language to describe it, when it's all the same thing. So you're really looking at the seed, or at the fruit, as 2 things, the skin and the seed, when there's so many levels. And I was talking to a friend about this too, that because coffee is such an important part of their economy, there should be a lot more words. Like that Eskimo with snow, if it's important, you should have way more language around it. And in Spanish right now, there really isn't. And I'm also seeing a lot of
Can
English
you not
words.
create them?
We can. I mean, they do have botanical terms, so we can use the botanical terms for those parts, but it's just not colloquial.
It's not commonplace right now.
Yeah, and even in English, we don't say that. We don't say exocarp, pericarp, mesocarp. Through
your education and through the rad work that you're doing, I'm so excited by what you're doing.
Thank you.
And I really I'm one of your champions, only because I think there needs to be more representation of 1, women in coffee, and 2, smart people in coffee.
But also outsiders, I think.
Yeah, I know you still see yourself as an outsider. I see you as a welcomed, right in the center of it person. But I think there's an opportunity once you get comfortable with realizing that you're not an outsider, and it'll take a minute for you. We all feel like a fraud for a really long time. But I think you could be that person that helps people just adopt the language.
Mm-hmm. I'm such a stickler, and I get a lot of resistance for people saying, like, because I really wanted people to stop saying fermentation for this process and call it microbial demucilagination.
Good luck.
Oh no, it's not working.
I was being absolutely sarcastic there. Good luck with that.
No one cares. No, really difficult. But for me, it's important because if we don't have the right language, then we really can't move forward.
Right. This is systemic in our whole industry, for lots of reasons. So it's called, say it again, microbial
demucilagination.
Demucilagination.
Right, because it's the mucilage is the part that's protecting the seed.
Bugs that are eating that away.
Right, and for most of how
demucilagination. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you are. I need to make a song and
my Aussie tongue finds it difficult to get around the demucilagination.
Demucilagination. I've been trying, but the reason why I wanted to do that is because when we use the same word fermentation so there's one word fermentation, and people say, oh well, wine's fermented, and cheese
and bread and
right, beer, all of these things. Well, when those other products and those other industries use that word, they use it as a way to add value to the product. We know that the fermentation
bubbles or with whatever it is.
Well, that if you choose, depending on the strain that you choose, you can have very different tasting beers. You can have your lagers, you can have a sour, you can have all kinds of, the microbes matter. Mm-hmm. In coffee, up until now, it's actually not necessary for coffee production to go through a fermentation step. It's optional. In all of those other industries, it's absolutely necessary. Without a fermentation, you will never turn juice into wine. You will never turn wort into beer. That milk will never become cheese. Mm-hmm. In coffee, because it's not necessary, it's a slightly different process. And the way that it affects the flavors, again, is different because the point of the fermentation in coffee is to remove the mucilage so that you can dry the seed.
Okay.
Because you can't dry the seed as part of processing. It's sticky, it's difficult,
right.
It gets stuck.
And other people use different methods rather than employing bugs.
Right, you could use a lot of water and friction and wash it off. So
or
that's
you
why
can
it's
dry
not
it
necessary.
and then...
and if you do the dry process, if you do like a natural and you have it up there and you don't go, that's still a fermentation. That's still happening. It's just not
as obvious.
It's not as obvious.
Are the bugs coming from the natural environment then?
Yes.
Right, so...
And they have done studies so most of the microbes are coming on the skin. But they have done studies where they have found that there are some bacteria that can permeate, and there are inside the mucilage. So there's some internal as well. It's not just on the outside, but most of them are on the outside.
So help me if I'm understanding this right with naturals, because I'm a fan of naturals. Mm-hmm. So essentially, let's say they're drying them on the ground. Mm-hmm. They have coffee piled up. As the heat hits the coffee, there's moisture that's being created as it's trying to escape through the cherry.
Well, there's moisture inside.
Inside that's trying to escape, right?
Not necessarily escape, but yes, there's both a dehydration process.
That's what I mean, yeah.
Yes, so I guess you could say.
Yeah, so the moisture...
It's evaporating.
It's evaporating. So the moisture is trying to escape through evaporation.
Yes.
And that creates an environment that's tasty for bugs. Mm-hmm. And that then accelerates the growth rate of the community of bugs that are there, their ecosystem. And do they then go nuts? Like what happens? So the bugs are there. Mm-hmm. How do they contribute? Are they then just eating all the sugars?
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. So they're eating the sugars, they're breaking down the pectins, they're also, and as they're doing that, so they're consuming the nutrients and then their waste, acids, alcohols, CO2, that's what we like and find interesting. So that contributes to, again, the breaking down of the mucilage and being able to, and so this is when we're talking about language. So I like to say dry process instead of natural, because I feel like there's a judgment that comes with, well, if this is natural, then the alternative is unnatural. Or like something else, like there's a value judgment to calling one process natural and the other stuff not. Everything else, it's like the other processes are natural as well. So that's another one of my battles, like fermentation, dry process.
Yeah, and look, we've been calling them naturals or dry, like ever since I can remember. But it's kind of one of those things that's stuck.
It's hard. I do it. I still do it too. I'm like, catch yourself.
Yeah. Well, we have to be that diligent now, and I think as an industry, it's platforms like this and the workshops that we're all doing that are trying to push that message about nomenclature. It's important. We need to start being very accurate in the way that we're doing things. Again, this comes with the idea of having a scientific and analytical approach to things. Don't be saying the words that everybody else used if they don't make any sense. And
so circle back, so we'll get back to how that happens in the dry process, but when we use the same word fermentation, I already had a context of what that meant from my microbiology training and from my winemaking. So like fermentation already means something. But in coffee, most people were using it in a really different context. And I mean coffee producers. I don't mean like roasters or baristas that I talk to. But producers, the people that were processing the coffee, were using the word fermentation as this kind of mechanical step to remove demucilage. And that's why I wanted to call it a microbial demucilagination, because they weren't...
Such a great word.
They weren't looking at it as this opportunity to add value and make the coffee better. It was like this neutral step.
So it was just doing a mechanical thing. It wasn't...
Right.
So they didn't see, or were they even testing if it was affecting taste?
I think...
Because I guess that's where you're going, right? Like that's the other part of that it adds to the process is...
Right, it adds flavor, but if it's done... If you just have a unique microclimate and the bugs there aren't great, then it could make the coffee worse and lead to spoilage. And so I found myself in this place where people would say, you know, some of the best coffee is when they just do mechanically washed coffee. They're like, it's really clean, it's really bright, it's fruity, the best coffee. Some of the best coffees coming out of Panama don't have any fermentation.
These are washed coffees, basically.
And these are fantastic. And then other people say, no, it's absolutely necessary. And when you have like very conflicting, almost opposite points of view, I usually find that they're both right. And that's because of the population that's doing this fermentation. If you have a good population, it will add value and make it better, and therefore you will have higher quality coffee if you go through this process. If you have a population that is just not adequate or you don't like those flavors, then it's much better to not do the fermentation, and your highest quality coffee will be completely avoiding that step. But it's not the fermentation, it's the population that's doing that action. So that's what I mean about kind of asking the wrong question. A lot of people ask the question of like, what's better, fermentation or not?
Right.
That's not the good question. No. The question is what they're doing that fermentation.
That's fascinating. You're blowing my mind right now because I have a bazillion questions. I'm fascinated with evolution in everything. And it started with a lot of it was why I started studying genetics. And I was really into evolutionary biology and particularly plant biology. And you mentioned something there about how certain bugs can create taste and as they're eating, the byproducts that they give off are gases and et cetera, et cetera.
So I talk about yeast farts.
Yeah. Right, so the yeast farts, but all the other, so different bugs create different flavors that we as humans like.
Right, it's a happy coincidence we happen to like what their waste tastes like.
I don't think it's a happy coincidence.
True.
I think there's this really great conversation that's going on right now as gut bacteria becomes a really big conversation amongst people who care about functional medicine and things like that. The idea is, have we evolved as a species as a host to our gut bacteria?
Actually, I believe that.
I'm not even kidding. Are you joking?
No, I believe that.
Yeah, so these bugs are our ancestors. And I don't think it's an accident that we happen to select for those flavors that are favoured by certain bug strains because it works in their favour that we should want to ingest them.
When I started like kind of changing my thinking in that direction was in reading some research that showed that your gut microflora will affect your like mental, your mood, and
oh yeah, like the gut brain relationship is so strong.
Right, thinking that it was just one way, but it's really a lot stronger. It's a double communication and can be a lot stronger from your gut up to your brain.
Have you seen those studies of there's a strain, I'm not sure if it's a parasite or if it's a bacteria, that once it gets into this certain mice, so it can only thrive in a cat gut. If it gets into a mouse, it tricks the mouse's brain into going closer to a cat.
No, that's fascinating.
Only because the bacteria signaling,
right, like I want to be near a cat.
I need the cat to eat you so that I can get into the cat's gut.
Yeah.
Isn't that fucking crazy?
Yes, that's fascinating.
Like, and this is what, like, that's why I had to talk to you when I found out a coffee sister who's talking about bugs. I love it. But the idea that this is starting to creep into our industry, and it can be a really fascinating aspect of how we're manipulating flavor, as well as how we can manipulate the quality of coffee, the way that people are experiencing it. I'm more than anything, it's going to be interesting as this becomes more prevalent.
Yeah.
What kinds of coffees the average drinker is naturally gravitating towards from a taste perspective, and what the correlation between that and the different strains of bacteria that you're using, or yeast, what the correlation with that will be in relation to the evolutionary aspects of are we being used as another host? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. That's the most interesting perspective I've had on flavor. Usually flavor is a thing that most people can like relate to, and that's what they want to talk about, and it's my least favorite thing to talk about because it's the least for me the least impactful thing that we can do with the microbes. So because I work with producers and because I work at Origin, I'm really interested in the process. So like one example of that is going back to the dry process, where you have these cherries on the patio or on a bed for 22 days kind of drying, and that takes 22 days of physical space for someone that needs to have like that much square footage. It takes labor to break them and continually turn them over so that you don't get mold on one side, so that they dry evenly. It takes those resources. So but people like that flavor profile, the natural profile, and
I wonder if that's because there's more bugs there.
Yeah, so that's part of it. So that's a heavily yeast dominated process. So if we take the same yeasts that are found in the dry process, those populations, those strains, and we can pulp the coffee, put it in a tank, ferment for 24, 36 hours, and then go dry, now you've done what took 22 days and 22 days of space and labor and get the same flavor profile in 36 hours. So for me, the flavor doesn't change. It's exactly the same, but you've just saved the producer 20 days.
Where does the economics come into that? Because a lot of the reasons, from my understanding, a lot of the reasons that places like Ethiopia and a lot of the African countries were using the dry processing method was because the availability of water was really scarce or very expensive. And so drying in the sun was the cheapest way to actually go about that process, right?
Yes. So, and I think that's where you have to look at kind of the changing landscape and what is scarce. So I don't work that much in Africa. I do like some kind of virtual consulting. I mostly work in Central America, where there is a lot more water, but where producers are being asked by roasters to do more naturals because they like that flavor profile. And it's really because the climate is so different in the tropical cloud rainforests of Central America versus like the drier climate in Africa. A lot of these suggestions are not panning out as well because the climate is not appropriate.
Favorable.
So one way that these producers can achieve that flavor profile, like again, it's not the process, it's what's present during the process. So if we just change, like you can still get a dry processed natural flavor, but do it in a washed where as a Central American producer, you have a lot, like you already have that infrastructure. So it's much easier to already use the tanks that you have, the water that you have, the structure that you have, and not build a whole bunch of raised beds and then maybe have to cover them because it rains too much and kind of head down in that wrong direction. So my goal in working with my clients is being able to give them those options, to say, you don't have to do a natural process to get a natural flavor, or there's more things we can do in a washed in the tank. And in Central America, there's a little bit more of a labor shortage. Like that's kind of a problem. So you don't have as many people available either to pick the coffee or to just be there constantly raking. And so you look at what is a natural resource. Maybe you do have a lot of water but not a lot of labor. How do we design a process around that? Or you don't have a lot of water but you have a ton of people available. Let's design a process around that.
And so there's a lot of process engineering that's going into that based on what the natural resources that you have available to you.
That's the biggest part of my job, is to come to a situation and say, okay, here are like 10 levers we have. We have this much sun, this much shade, this much square footage, this many tanks,
This many humans.
this many humans that are here. Okay, we have like this many humans that are coming, but they come on bus, so they can only be here for 14 hours. And then, and then I design a process with a certain flavor profile based on their needs. And most of the time, we're trying to achieve a very similar profile, and I go to a different place, and to get a similar, clean, sweet cup, we have to do things, 180.
Wow.
Completely different.
Is the language that you're talking to these farmers, do you work at the farm rather than at the mill? Or do you combine the two? Okay.
Both. Mostly, my work is at the mill, but a lot of mill
with the
also
farmers?
owns.
Right.
Yeah.
So is a lot of the language that you're going to these people with for the first time complete gibberish?
Yes. Yes. and I'm trying really hard to, find a different way to communicate, because in a way I want to be as accurate and scientific as possible, but that's also
intimidating
or inaccessible.
Yep.
And so I find myself really struggling with my training to describe things in words, to say bugs, to say bacteria is just kind of like a blanket term, to really simplify things, almost to the point where like sometimes you have to say things that aren't quite true to make a point. And so like for me in my microbiological training, I say a lot of things, I simplify things so much that it's almost not true, but if I didn't do that, we really couldn't move forward. So that's just my personal struggle.
But, and it's people tend to not all people think analytically, not all people think logically, and so you have to simplify it beyond logic and beyond common sense, so that it can be something that's actually a 15-step process. You'll explain it in 2 or 3 steps. Yeah. And it's so simplified at this point that it could almost be not true. Yeah. But it is that, it's just much more complicated.
Right, at this level. And I think that's an important distinction too, is having that, we think logical, and for me, I equate logical with a linear, step 1, step 2, step 3, having that progression. But so much of biology is systems and things that loop back in on each other and that depend on this, and you change this and these 15 things change. And so it's a dynamic system, but that's so difficult to convey. So a lot of the times I have to, break things down in a way that's not my preferred way. And so I'm kind of excited and hoping more people will get more elevated, so I can really have those types of conversations and get to the part that I want to talk about. But it's we have so much foundation to cover first.
I think that, do you know the guys at La Palma?
No, not personally. I
but you know with what they're doing.
Yeah, I follow their Instagram and I'm aware of their social media, but I have not had any conversations with them.
I think places like that are investing so much money into the popularization of what they're doing is absolutely going to be a help for your cause. And just help people think that, there's this, because this is how it'll go. There's someone over there, La Palma, you are there's someone over there who's doing something weird and sciencey, and I don't get it, but I'm going to sit back here and pretend like I don't like what it is, and just watch it really carefully. And this is the way everything in innovation goes. And people are going to watch that and what you're doing, and they're going to see you affect coffee in a really positive way. And once you have done that with enough people, a tipping point will start to emerge, where there are more and more people saying to you, because there are people who are advocating for you, and saying, no, like, get on board with this, because this is going to fast track your brand being something that's more consistent, being something that has more favorable flavors. Like, it'll get you there quicker.
Right. I think that with
you're not a fraud. Like, you're not one of these people. and sorry, I wanted to finish my thought there.
Yeah.
You're not one of these people who's selling something that maybe will and maybe won't work. It's an actual thing. This is a sure thing. If you do this, you will get a better quality coffee. You will get higher prices for your coffee, and it will sell quicker.
Well, I mean, and that's not even to talk about all the like stability and the shelf life and all of the other stuff down the line.
That's not even, we're not even close to that yet.
But what, you know, what my mission now is to just get people to pay attention. Like, this could actually be a really low investment in your mill, because it isn't necessarily about purchasing some yeast strains or, you know, adding something to the process, but like I said, taking off the blindfold and seeing what am I already doing that's affecting my flavors. Not looking at your water source, not looking at your tank and material, and just general hygiene and cleaning. Like, there's a very low cost way that you can start to pay attention and change the quality, because you didn't even realize how it was being affected by these factors.
Cafes are a great previous example of that experience. In the second wave world, just a simple thing like people not cleaning the steam wand, and they would froth milk and not even wipe it down, right? Not thinking that there was anything hygienically wrong with it.
Yeah, mills will horrify you.
Oh, I'm a germaphobe. I've only recently figured that out, and I think it's residual from my degree, in the sense that once you've got that exposure to all of the stuff that happens when you're taking microbiology classes, you're like, I'm not fucking touching anything. And it happened very subconsciously. And only recently I've come to realize, like, I was going to boil some water in the coffee pot.
Yeah.
I can't do it. I haven't used a microwave. In near on 10 years.
Okay.
And I would rather microwave water to make a cup of tea than use a coffee pot in an Airbnb that I've never used. That was when I'm like, no, I really am a germaphobe.
I think that's something that may be surprising about me, like, because I do have really strong microbiology training, and I took all of the, part of my training was a food safety class to understand, you know, the doubling time of a lot of these pathogens and where they live and temperature ranges and things like that. I'm very intimate with those, like, the log scales of how quickly microbes grow. And I'm just really gross. Like, I will eat meat that's been left out overnight. I will eat, like, I just don't have, like, I'm not a germaphobe. Like, I will eat old food. I will try, like, anybody's glass of anything. Like, I'm just...
See, that I'm fine with. But only if I'm familiar with the environment. Like, if, I don't know, like, I don't eat meat anymore, so I think that's helped in the sense that if I've left a salad out overnight, I'm happy to come back to it, even though I know that there is bugs that have been happily growing in that environment. But I also know that those bugs aren't going to hurt me, because I know what they would have been doing if there was meat on there. Yeah. Especially living in sunny Southern California, where it's always hot.
Yeah.
And that's going to accelerate some not so great. But in a salad, I'm good, because there's nothing in there that's going to kill me. Same thing if it's moldy bread. I'm like, I'll just cut the mold off.
Yeah.
You know, or when I used to eat cheese or whatever. You know, I understand what that does, but it's the things of, I don't know who was in here before me.
Right.
And I don't know how they've cleaned it. And I don't know what people have done to I've watched far too many fucking YouTube videos to see what people do to coffee pots in places that they've never been.
That's fair. I mean, I wouldn't do it either, because like I said, I'm not really a coffee person. I'm more of a tea person. So then my other dirty little secret.
Hey, I'm a tea person, I confess. The only way I drink, I mean, I had an espresso with Jared earlier today. and drank maybe a quarter of it. And then came back and had a cup of tea.
Awesome.
Because the only way I really drink coffee now is as a elixir. You'll have some tomorrow.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say this about mold. This was one of my favorite things, and I remember I got my mom, because she would do that too. She would just cut off the corner of like bread or whatever. And I'm like, with the mold that you see is the flour. And so you're just cutting off like the flour. You're still eating. Like by the time you see the mold, it's been
gone
permeated.
through the whole thing.
The whole thing is covered in mold.
Oh yeah.
You're just cutting off the flour. You're not eating. You're still eating all of the roots and all of that.
I remember when I was.
That makes me feel better, Mom.
I remember when I was studying in my first year of biology, in my second year of university, studying microbiology for the first time. And I was learning about penicillin and how you could do artwork with growing different kinds of molds. And I'm like, this is for me. Like, if you can paint with pretty different pictures of bacteria and mold, this is the thing to do. And I started trying to grow it on bread.
Cool.
It didn't work, but it was very Picasso-esque of that kind of thing. But it was just fun to realize that you could do all this stuff and fuck bacteria up in a really fun, great way.
No, it's really fun.
I wanted to talk to you about mold on coffee after processing and after drying, when it's green and it's been bagged and it's on the way here or wherever it's going. Talk to me about what kinds of molds and bacteria and spores get left behind, or the opposite of that, actually remain, and how we can guarantee that when we roast the coffee, that those things no longer exist.
So I think that's a pretty common misconception, but connection that a lot of people make is the mycotoxins or the ochratoxins that remain versus the live agents.
So what are the kinds of microtoxins that we're talking about? Like, what are microtoxins for anyone who's listening and doesn't know?
So what are they?
Yeah, so in a general sense, they're the toxins that
some fungus found in the soil, found in the environment, can create. So even if you no longer have, like, say, aspergillus that is live and active, that at some point, if that aspergillus was and made some ochratoxin A or something like that, it could be left. And I'm not very familiar with the stats on how much roasting does to reduce the levels that are found there. But from a preventative point of what people can do is a lot of that contamination that can be avoided happens in the tank. So you can have a really clean, you can come in from the field, and when you're in your fermentation tank, that's a really good opportunity because you have all that moisture for these fungus to grow. If you're controlling your fermentation and having it be more dominated by yeast, or especially inoculating, that significantly outcompetes the fungus.
The yeast will outcompete the fungus.
Yes.
And destroy it?
Well, it's not a destroying thing. It's just it's consuming the resources, so the aspergillus can't grow. So
the fungus isn't able to thrive in that environment, and therefore the yeast is consuming all the resources that are available.
Yes. And therefore you would have, safe, kind of clean coffee, but it's possible to have a really great fermentation, outcompete it there, and then put it in a dirty bag.
And then it thrives. That was my next question, is are they just laying dormant in that tank, waiting to find or potentially get into another environment where they can thrive?
At that point, I don't think so. I think when there's another, point of contact, it's a different contamination from another place. I don't think that they can survive being in the tank, like you said. I mean, they are incredibly hardy and can't have spores just laying there waiting. I don't think that's what happens. I think if you do have a really sound fermentation,
it's being picked up along the way somewhere in the environment or the system.
Yeah, it's being picked up in on the truck, on the pallets, in the bags,
in the air,
and another point. So I think that's really tough because I don't feel comfortable saying if you do X, Y, and Z, you will be guaranteed to be safe. There's a lot of things you can do to reduce your risk, and I think a lot of that is monitoring. I don't think that people are checking as often as they can to figure out where is this coming from. Is it coming from the truck? Is it coming from the bags? Is it coming from the pallets? Is it coming off the ship? Is it in our warehouse? Maybe it has something to do with
Do they
the
even know
origin.
how to do that?
I think I don't know. I don't know if people do know, but it's a pretty simple, get some swabs and see at one point, because you can do those ATP swabs and see like where is the activity coming from. And you can just pinpoint like here it wasn't, here it wasn't, here it wasn't, now it showed up here. And
so there was something that happened from the pallet to the truck. It was on the forklift. We'll swab the forklift now and see if that's the point.
So few people have that level of traceability from this cherry to now it's in this warehouse, somewhere in the United States. So I think the first part is having much more traceability from bag, from origin to...
as a standard part of the process, right?
Yeah.
Not as a, oh fuck, somebody died because of... I mean, it's not going to happen, but in the sense that something went wrong.
Yeah.
Now we've got to go and trace it back. If you had that data already,
Right.
that's going to give you the reference point that you need.
Right.
Because it could have been that literally there happened to be a rat that was particularly sick that took a shit somewhere near some coffee bags and some off run of water happened to get onto the beans that were around this bag that brushed up against something, and it's that kind of thing.
Right.
Right?
Yes. I mean, like I said, it can be. It also could be coming in from the field, and it could be coming from your fermentation tank, and it could be a lot of different places. But before you start to say like, where is this? Then I have to say like, how traceable is your coffee?
Right.
Because otherwise, we're not like you need to do that, and then we can figure out where it's coming from. And I'm not a mycotoxin expert, but I do know that if it is coming from the tank, like if that's your only source, then inoculating with yeast is a very powerful way to combat that, because the yeast will outcompete and you can get really stable coffee. Again, that doesn't mean that you won't recontaminate it different down the line, but that is the biggest source most of the time, coming in from the field on the cherries or in the fermentation tank.
How difficult is it for you to convince people that you know what you're talking about?
Now less so. I mean, in the beginning, it was really difficult because I look younger than I am. I'm a woman, and in a Latin macho world, it was very difficult. Now I really only work. Now I have the luxury of just choosing to work with people that want to work with me. And if they're hiring me to come and work with them, they've already have some level
a referral
or some level of buy-in, or they are interested to hear what I have to say. So I don't feel very much anymore that I have to prove what I have to say, because I've worked with enough people that I can get references. And but yeah, the first 3 years it was just kind of voodoo and weird. But I luckily don't deal with that anymore. Not very much.
How much of that had to do with people in coffee weren't adopting this idea that fermentation or demucilagination was not just something that might work, versus she's a woman, I'm not convinced she's going to know what she's talking about?
That had very little, in my experience, to do with kind of coffee. It had more to do with my work structure, in terms of doing this work for Scott Laboratories and doing it more in a research capacity, and then kind of just accepting whoever wanted to work with us. And then I would show up and do this work. And that wasn't an effective strategy. Like, that's where a lot of people didn't believe what I had to say until
the woo-woo science,
until they tasted the coffee. And then sometimes the changes were so dramatic that they still didn't believe it. They're like, I don't know what you did.
She's got some weird intuitive sciencey way of, she waves her hands across the water and communicates with the bugs somehow.
Exactly. So it took several months from the time of my visit until we could actually taste the coffee so that they could taste the difference and say, okay, there's something here. But even then, it's still, because of that structure of working within that company, I had a really hard time getting people to take me seriously, to take my suggestions. And again, it was very focused on yeast and not focused on the entire process. And so many people that I visited could get a lot more quality improvement from sorting than from applying yeast. And so the effects of the yeast were really diluted because a lot of the processing practices were just poor or not optimized. And so I spent a lot of time not talking about yeast, really talking about
better farming practices or better milling practices and processing practices.
And drying and kind of all of those other components. And so what really changed my work was going independent and saying I'm an independent consultant, and my work is exactly the same. I do the same thing that I did for Scott Labs, but now I get to choose my clients, and I get to have, again, a bigger world because we can talk about the entire process, and I don't feel that I need to focus so heavily on yeast, even though I've been known as the yeast girl. And that's a really great entry point, but that's what showed me we have a lot more work to do. Like, this is a Band-Aid that a lot of people want to apply.
So do you spend more of your time as a process engineer or as a bug microbiologist?
I think that those are two, I can't separate them. They're pretty much the same thing, because I come at it from the point of the perspective of the microbiologist who needs to engineer all of these processes. So
that you can get to an optimal point where the bugs that you're going to introduce into the system can thrive.
So exactly. So I guess on the outside it looks like I'm a process engineer because I'm really just talking about...
But it's a part of the job.
But I'm doing it from the perspective of, like, I'm looking at all of the equipment. I'm looking at everything from the perspective of that's going to grow a lot. That's going to be a really hospitable environment. No, this is going to be better. Like, how to manage the environment, like the environment of around the bugs, not the ambient environment. Just what's in the what the yeast and bacteria are going to be interacting with. So I'm managing the environment in terms of oxygen availability, how much nutrients are there, what's the pH that we're going to manage, what's the temperature that we're going to manage. But it's all kind of engineering the space.
Talking about the terms and talking about what you were just saying, I was reading on your Instagram a post that you made about a question that someone said, I can't remember the specifics, but it was something about anaerobic fermentation. And your response to it was, I'm often confused when people refer to anaerobic fermentation as fermentation that happens in water, in fermentation tanks, because they're assuming that
oxygen.
There is oxygen in water. How much of a battle is you trying to help people get over their preconceptions of what fermentation and these terms that they don't quite understand? Like, is a lot of your time spent trying to get everybody on the same page with the nomenclature?
Yes, it is. And it honestly should be more. It's not something that I really enjoy doing and that I'm super good at, so I try to avoid it. But I realize that I'm not having as much success or impact if I don't do this. So I'm, by doing this workshop here in Seattle, and again reaching out more to the roasting community. It's not something that I usually do. I work with producers, my clients are producers, I work at Origin, that's 90% of what I do. But most of the people, I live in the United States, and most of the people that I do kind of interact with on social media are roasters, and so there's a little bit of a push and pull or a conflict for me, where most of my time is spent communicating to people that are not my clients, and it's not my work. But if they're not on board, then they're not going to buy the coffee from my producers.
That's what I was about to say.
So I do need to get everybody.
You need to loop it around because that's how your work is going to get more prolific, by people requesting it. The roasters requesting coffee that you've worked on.
And for me, success is not going to be when people talk about fermentation. To me, success is going to be when it's so common, everyone's doing it, nobody's talking about it. I don't want people to talk about fermentation and yeast, and I want them to talk about process or good coffee. Like, I want this to just be standard.
When you say good coffee, and that term for me is one of my pet hates because it's so personal what we all think is good coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say good coffee, what do you actually mean by that?
I think that is easy, and I do think that for me and my wine training, when I say good, I mean something that is well crafted. I don't have to like it. There doesn't have to be any objective component to this coffee being good. I can like something, or I can say something is good without personally liking it. And for me, that means well crafted in terms of not having defects and being consistent and having a balance of structure, acidity, and sweetness.
And it tastes clean.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that people, something that I observe is that people say a lot of words, they use a lot of words and say nothing because, yeah. And they don't actually understand what they mean. They want people to think they know what they mean. Do you experience a lot of that in what you're doing?
Absolutely. And I think it comes with this nomenclature and saying things like anaerobic fermentation, where we think we're being more specific and more descriptive, but it's redundant and confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Or even the way that we're naming a lot of these. It's something I'm going to talk about in the workshop, is the namings of carbonic maceration or hydro honey, or we're just kind of coming up with all of these terms without a basis of where the flavor's coming from or of processing.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to kind of get ahead of that and say, like, hold on, let's pull it back. Like, everyone's kind of having all of these ways to describe the coffee that aren't actually describing the flavor and where it's coming from.
That's fascinating. Which leads me to another question. Can you control how much of the mucilage the bugs will get through? You know how when we talk about wash coffees and honey processed, and the honey process is like there's not all of the mucilage is taken away.
Mm-hmm.
Can you control how much the bugs eat?
Not unless you could only control it by sterilizing or introducing a new population that would outcompete what's existing.
So stopping the fermentation process after a certain amount of time.
Yes, that's the only way.
Do these bugs only eat the mucilage, or do they start eating through into the the bean?
I'm not so they are too large to permeate that boundary. And so I think that's another misconception, is that if it goes too long, that they're going to consume the sweetness that's inside the seed instead of just sticking to the outside. And the carbohydrates that are inside are very different from what's on the outside, so that doesn't happen. You're not taking sweetness away.
So you're selecting for strains
Yes.
that aren't small enough to permeate the bean.
Well, no microbiz that we know of at this point. Small enough.
Thank you for qualifying.
that we know of right now, able to permeate that boundary. What I think can happen is other, things move to their place of lower concentration. So if we do...
Wait, what time is your dinner?
I know, I have to go soon.
Yeah. Oh my God, we've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes.
That went by really quickly.
That really did. Sorry, I'm so fascinated by what you're saying. Go on.
No worries. So a lot of people think that we're taking the sweetness away if you ferment too long, because it's consuming on the outside, and then it's going to get the sugar on the inside. And again, what's on the inside is just carbohydrates. It doesn't get turned into these compounds until roasting.
Right.
It's not sugar in the seed.
Right.
It's cellulose.
Yeah.
So it's not the same thing, and it doesn't permeate. So I think that's another place where there's some confusion over what's happening in terms of the flavor. So I think your question was like, can you stop it so that you don't go too far?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a risk, that you'll go too far. It's just, too far for most people means over fermentation defects and spoilage, but that's not.
And will it affect the flavor? Like if you let's say that you only really need 30 hours in a tank, and I'm just pulling the number out of my ass, but let's say you needed 30 hours in a tank and all the mucilage was going to be gone. If you leave it in there for 36 hours, is that going to affect the flavor?
Yes.
So is it like spoiling?
It depends on the population. So you know that with longer contact, you will have more of an impact. It's up to the population whether it's a positive impact or a defect.
Okay. And is that because the longer you're leaving it in there, the more the population is thriving?
Mm-hmm.
And as they thrive and grow in numbers, they're
producing more byproducts.
Which is, oh, right.
And so it's like you have a piece of meat and you're leaving it marinating. If you leave it marinating for 20 hours versus 1 hour, you're going to have a stronger flavor. The flavors are just, they're still there, but they need time to permeate.
Into the bean.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I could talk to you for 6 hours. I've really enjoyed this, but I know you have dinner reservations.
I do, I have to run.
And promise me you'll come back.
Of course.
This was really, really fun.
Good.
Thank you. We didn't even talk about half the shit I wanted to talk to you about. But let's do this again.
Absolutely.
And if people want to find you, how can they do that?
Mostly on Instagram. I'm very active there, posting what I'm up to, what traveling I'm doing, and then kind of stories where you can find coffee that I've worked on. So that's at LLUCIA Solis, double L for Lucia Solis, and my website, lucia.coffee, if somebody wants to hire me to come to their farm.
The best of luck with the workshops.
Thank you.
Are there any spots left?
For if you speak Spanish.
Okay. If you speak Spanish and you want to come to the workshops, what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow morning?
Tomorrow at 11.
At 11?
Yeah, April 19th.
Right, tomorrow at 11 for 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. Taste some coffees, ask questions, and then get Microbiology 101 for coffee.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. It's been really fun.
My pleasure.
It felt like no time at all, so thanks for that. Oh, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah.